In September of 2021, inside a genetics lab at Kanazawa University in Japan, a research team led by Professor Shigeki Nakagomi and his colleagues were staring at freshly sequenced DNA pulled from ancient human bones, and what they saw did not match the story that every Japanese schoolchild had been taught for generations. For decades, the accepted explanation for where the Japanese people came from rested on a simple two-part formula, a story so widely accepted it had become almost sacred in anthropology textbooks. But the data glowing on the researchers' screens told a different story, one with an entire hidden chapter nobody had accounted for. A mysterious third ancestor had left its fingerprint across the genome of nearly every modern Japanese person alive today, and almost no one, not historians, not archaeologists, not even geneticists studying this exact question for years, had seen it coming. To understand why this discovery shook the foundations of Japanese anthropology, you have to go back much further, tens of thousands of years, to the earliest people who ever set foot on the Japanese archipelago. Modern humans are known to have inhabited Japan at least as far back as 32,000 years ago, arriving as small bands of hunter-gatherers during the depths of the last ice age. Sometime later, between roughly 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, rising sea levels flooded the land bridges connecting Japan to the Asian mainland, sealing the archipelago off from the rest of the continent. The people trapped inside that new island world became the Jomon, one of the most remarkable and least understood ancient populations on Earth. For the next several thousand years, they lived almost entirely cut off from outside contact, hunting, fishing, and gathering along Japan's coastlines and forests, developing intricate pottery techniques so early and so advanced that some of the oldest known ceramic vessels on the entire planet come from Jomon sites. Geneticists studying the Jomon eventually discovered something extraordinary about their isolation. Genomic analysis revealed that the Jomon maintained an unusually small population, an effective breeding population of only around 1,000 individuals sustained across several thousand years of complete geographic isolation. Think about how strange that actually is. An entire culture spread across an island chain, surviving and thriving for millennia, while genetically behaving almost like one small, tightly knit extended family, isolated from the genetic churn and mixing happening constantly across the rest of the Asian mainland. This isolation left an unmistakable signature buried deep in their DNA, one so distinct that scientists studying their mitochondrial DNA found extremely high frequencies of specific genetic markers, known as haplogroups N9b and M7a, that show up at drastically lower rates almost everywhere else on the Asian continent. Their Y chromosome data told a similar story, dominated by a lineage called DM55, a marker so specific to Japan that researchers essentially treat it as a genetic fingerprint unique to the Jomon and their descendants. For a long time, the leading scientific explanation for the Jomon's origin was that they arrived in Japan following an ancient coastal migration route stretching all the way from Southeast Asia into East Asia, eventually settling the archipelago as descendants of Upper Paleolithic people who had first arrived roughly 38,000 years ago. Whole genome sequencing of Jomon skeletons, including a well-studied individual from the Funado-Mari site in Hokkaido, confirmed something remarkable: that the Jomon lineage split away from other continental Asian populations somewhere between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, almost exactly matching the moment Japan became physically isolated by rising seas. In other words, the moment Japan became an island was, genetically speaking, the exact moment the Jomon people became their own distinct, separate branch of humanity, a branch that would then sit largely untouched by outside influence for well over 10,000 years. Then, in November of 2025, an entirely new layer of mystery was added to this already strange story. A team of researchers analyzing the genome of a Jomon individual who lived nearly 4,000 years ago discovered something startling buried inside their DNA, or more accurately, something conspicuously absent from it. Nearly every population across East Asia, Oceania, Southeast Asia, and even parts of the Americas carries small but measurable traces of DNA inherited from the Denisovans, a mysterious group of extinct archaic humans who lived across Eurasia between roughly 200,000 and 30,000 years ago, cousins of the Neanderthals known mostly through a handful of fossil fragments discovered in a Siberian cave. Scientists expected the Jomon, given their deep East Asian roots, to carry a typical share of this ancient Denisovan ancestry. Instead, the Jomon individual analyzed carried only a tiny fraction, of the Denisovan DNA found in modern Japanese people today. A genetic gap so pronounced that researchers described it as pointing toward a deep East Asian lineage that had either almost never encountered Denisovans or interacted with them so rarely that the genetic evidence of that contact essentially never took hold. The study, which examined DNA pulled from a broad sweep of 115 ancient individuals spanning locations across East Asia, Siberia, West Eurasia, the Americas, and Southeast Asia, alongside 279 modern genomes, revealed something almost eerie. This particular ancient Japanese lineage appeared to be walking around with dramatically less contact with these vanished archaic humans than virtually anyone else on the entire Eurasian landmass. And then the story took another twist. If the deep ancestral Jomon carried almost no Denisovan DNA, where did the meaningful Denisovan ancestry present in modern Japanese people actually come from? The answer traced back to a much later, much more dramatic chapter in Japanese history, the Kofun period, an era of early state formation and imperial consolidation that lasted roughly from 300 to 710 AD. During this period, researchers found a noticeable rise in Denisovan ancestry appearing in the Japanese gene pool, evidence pointing toward entirely new waves of migration flooding into Japan from mainland East Asia, bringing with them genetic influences that had never touched the isolated Jomon population at all. This finding didn't just solve one mystery, it opened up a much larger one, hinting that Japan's population history involved far more waves of migration and mixing than the simple story anyone had assumed. That simple story is worth explaining, because for decades, it was treated as settled scientific fact. Known as the dual structure model, it proposed that modern Japanese people descend from exactly two ancestral sources, the indigenous Jomon hunter-gatherers, who had lived in isolation for thousands of years, and a wave of incoming farmers called the Yayoi, who arrived from the Asian mainland roughly 3,000 years ago, bringing wet rice agriculture, bronze and iron tools, and fundamentally transforming Japanese society from small foraging bands into organized farming communities. Under this model, modern Japanese genetics were essentially a blend of these two groups, ancient island hunter-gatherers mixing with mainland farmers, a tidy-to-ingredient recipe that most scientists were comfortable accepting for years. The problem was, nobody had ever properly tested this theory using large-scale, high-quality ancient genomic data pulled directly from skeletons spanning Japan's entire prehistoric timeline. That gap in the research was exactly what Professor Nakagome's team, working alongside colleagues including Niall Cook and Takashi Gakuhari, set out to close. Their approach was ambitious. Rather than relying on scattered, low-quality genetic samples, the team sequenced 12 entirely new ancient Japanese genomes, spanning 8,000 years of the archipelago's history, and combined that fresh data with 5 previously published ancient genomes, including Jomon individuals and early Yayoi period remains. This gave them, at the time, the largest and most comprehensive set of precisely time-stamped ancient genomes ever assembled from the Japanese archipelago, including the oldest Jomon individual sequenced up to that point, and crucially, the very first genomic data ever pulled directly from individuals of the imperial Kofun period. When the results came back, the dual structure model didn't just get refined, it got completely rewritten. The data revealed unmistakably that rice cultivation had indeed been introduced by incoming people carrying Northeast Asian ancestry, largely matching the traditional Yayoi migration story. But then, unexpectedly, the genomic data showed something the two-ancestor model had never predicted, a completely separate, later influx of East Asian ancestry arriving specifically during the Kofun period. A genetic signature distinct enough from the earlier Yayoi migration wave that it had to represent an entirely separate historical event. The Kofun period individuals in their dataset clustered tightly with modern Japanese populations today, strongly suggesting that this third wave, arriving during Japan's transition into a unified, state-level imperial society, played just as significant a role in shaping the modern Japanese gene pool as the far more famous Yayoi rice farmers had. This is how the tripartite model of Japanese ancestry was born, a complete overhaul of decades of accepted scientific consensus. Instead of two ancestral ingredients, modern Japanese genetics turned out to be built from 3, the indigenous Jomon hunter-gatherer fishers, who survived in isolation for over 10,000 years. A Northeast Asian component tied to the Elmore River Basin region of northern China that arrived alongside wet rice farming roughly 3,000 years ago during the Yayoi period. And finally, a major and previously invisible influx of ancestry resembling present-day East Asian populations, similar to modern Han Chinese, that swept into Japan during the Kofun period roughly 1700 years ago, tightly linked to the exact historical moment when early Japanese imperial state formation was taking shape. Professor Nakagomi later explained just how significant this gap in scientific understanding had actually been, noting that although researchers had been learning more and more about the cultures of the Jomon, Yayoi, and Kofun periods as archaeological artifacts continued turning up, almost nothing was previously known about the actual genetic origins and genetic impact tied to the agricultural transition and the later state formation phase of Japanese history. In plain terms, historians and archaeologists had been piecing together Japan's cultural history for generations using pottery, tools, and burial sites, while the genetic story hiding inside actual human remains had remained almost completely unread the entire time. Interestingly, this wasn't a case of one clean, simple, easily explainable migration event either. Follow-up research examining the Yayoi period more closely, published in October of 2024, added an important layer of geographic detail to this story, demonstrating that the majority of immigration into the Japanese archipelago during both the Yayoi and Kofun periods, spanning a huge stretch of time between roughly 3000 BCE and 538 AD, actually originated specifically from the Korean peninsula, rather than sweeping in broadly and vaguely from mainland Asia as a whole. This pinpointed exactly where these transformative population waves were coming from, adding real geographic precision to what had previously been a much blurrier picture of ancient East Asian migration patterns. The story didn't stop at simply mapping where modern Japanese ancestry came from either. In November of 2024, an entirely new research team, publishing in Nature Communications, decided to ask a much stranger and more personal question. If this ancient Jomon ancestry is still detectable inside the genomes of modern Japanese people today, does it actually still shape anything about how those people look, feel, or function physically, even now, thousands of years later? To answer that question, researchers merged an enormous dataset, Biobank Japan, containing genetic information from 171,287 living individuals, together with 22 ancient Japanese and broader Eurasian genomes. What they found was almost unsettling in its precision. There was an extremely strong, statistically powerful correlation between how much Jomon ancestry a modern individual carried and specific patterns of genomic variation detectable in their body today. Researchers identified that this ancient hunter-gatherer genetic legacy underlies elevated body mass index, or BMI, in modern Japanese individuals, essentially showing that ancient adaptations, likely shaped by a hunter-gatherer lifestyle focused on surviving lean periods and irregular food availability thousands of years ago, are still actively influencing modern metabolism today. The researchers went further, actually building a genetic prediction model using 132 specific genetic variants capable of estimating how much Jomon ancestry any individual Japanese person carries, and then validated that model against two completely independent, massive Japanese genetic cohorts, one containing nearly 3,000 people, the other containing over 72,000. They even confirmed the same BMI connection held true using East Asian participants pulled from the UK Biobank, proving this wasn't some strange artifact limited to one dataset, but a real, reproducible biological signal. Then, in late 2025, an even more detailed follow-up study pushed this research further still, and in the process, quietly overturned yet another long-held assumption. Earlier research had estimated that Jomon ancestry made up somewhere around 13% of the modern mainland Japanese genome. But this newer analysis, built on 8 newly sequenced high-coverage Jomon genomes spanning roughly 9,000 to 2,800 years ago and pulled from sites across the archipelago, produced a strikingly different number. Using genomes recovered from the Todoroki and Chidori Kubo archaeological sites, specifically, researchers now estimate Jomon ancestry in mainland Japanese populations sits closer to 20%, substantially higher than every previous estimate. That is not a small correction. That is nearly a 50% increase in how much ancient hunter-gatherer DNA modern mainland Japanese people are now understood to actually carry, a jump significant enough to meaningfully change how scientists interpret the entire genetic history of the country. This same research also uncovered something the earlier, simpler models had completely missed: meaningful genetic diversity hidden within the Jomon population itself. Rather than treating the Jomon as one single, uniform genetic block, this newer analysis revealed clear temporal stratification, distinct genetic sublayers separated by both time and geography. The earliest individuals studied, associated with what researchers call the initial Jomon period, formed their own distinct, earliest branching lineage, one that showed noticeably weaker genetic affinities to present-day Japanese people compared to later Jomon populations. In other words, even within a single ancient culture that most people assume was genetically uniform, there were actually multiple, distinguishable genetic chapters layered on top of each other across thousands of years, each contributing differently to the DNA carried by Japanese people alive right now. Nowhere does this internal diversity show up more dramatically than in the southern Ryukyu Islands, the chain of islands stretching down toward Okinawa, far from mainland Japan. A separate genetic analysis focused specifically on this region uncovered a deep divergence between what researchers call Ryukyu Jomon and mainland Hondo Jomon populations, a genetic split dating back roughly 6,900 years, remarkably ancient even by Jomon standards. Following that split, the Ryukyu lineage experienced a severe population bottleneck, shrinking down to an effective population size of only around 2,000 individuals, before eventually mixing with historic migrants arriving from the Japanese mainland roughly 1,000 years ago. The genetic consequences of this isolated, separate history are still measurable today. Modern populations across the Ryukyu Islands carry significantly higher proportions of Jomon ancestry than people living on mainland Japan, meaning geography alone, the simple accident of which specific island chain your ancestors happened to live on thousands of years ago, still meaningfully shapes the genetic makeup of Japanese citizens living today. Step back now and look at the full arc of this story, because it is genuinely remarkable how much has changed in such a short span of scientific research. For most of the 20th century, the origin story of the Japanese people was treated as settled, straightforward, and essentially closed, a simple blend of ancient island hunter-gatherers and mainland rice farmers. Modern ancient DNA sequencing has completely dismantled that simplicity, revealing instead a layered, complicated, and genuinely surprising history involving at least 3 distinct ancestral populations. Hidden waves of migration tied directly to the rise of imperial Japanese statehood, measurable biological consequences from ancient hunter-gatherer adaptations still influencing modern body composition today, and entire hidden genetic subdivisions within the Jomon population itself that nobody had even thought to look for until recently. Perhaps most strikingly of all, the amount of ancient hunter-gatherer DNA running through the veins of modern mainland Japanese people has already been revised sharply upward once, climbing from an estimated 13% to a newly calculated 20%, and researchers openly admit that with only 2 Jomon individuals ever sequenced at truly high coverage so far, from the Funadomari and Yayoi sites, that number could very plausibly shift again as more ancient genomes are recovered and analyzed. There's also still a real, gaping hole sitting right in the middle of this entire timeline, one that scientists are actively racing to fill. Modern humans are confirmed to have been living in Japan at least 32,000 years ago, yet the oldest fully analyzed Jomon genome currently available belongs to someone who lived only around 9,000 years ago. That leaves a staggering 23,000-year gap in the genetic record, a stretch of Japanese prehistory where scientists currently have almost no direct ancient DNA evidence at all. Researchers studying this exact gap have stated plainly that filling in those missing millennia with actual ancient DNA will be essential to fully understanding how early populations spread across East Asia, and precisely how and when their encounters, or surprising lack of encounters, with archaic human groups like the Denisovans ultimately shaped the genetic landscape we see across the region today. What makes this entire unfolding story so compelling isn't just the sheer complexity hiding inside the science, it's what it reveals about how quickly a settled, textbook version of history can completely unravel the moment better tools finally arrive to test it properly. For most of Japanese history, going back thousands of years, nobody, not the Jomon hunter-gatherers isolated on their forested coastlines, not the Yayoi rice farmers arriving from the Korean peninsula, not the Kofun period elites building the foundations of imperial Japanese statehood, had any way of knowing their bloodlines were quietly merging into a genetic tapestry that would still be measurably influencing the bodies, metabolisms, and even the regional identities of their descendants tens of thousands of years later. It took a small research team in Kanazawa, sequencing ancient bones in 2021, followed by wave after wave of increasingly precise genetic studies stretching all the way through 2025, to finally begin reading a story that had been sitting quietly, completely unnoticed, inside Japanese DNA the entire time.